Okay, and now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. James J. Wirtz, the Dean of the School of International Graduate Studies at the Naval Postgraduate School. Dr. Wirtz has served as chair of the National Security Affairs from 2000 to 2005. He currently serves as Dean of the School of International Graduate Studies and Director of the Global Center for Security Cooperation. Professor Wirtz is the author of The Tet Offensive, Intelligence Failure in War, co-editor of numerous books, including The Absolute Weapon Revisited, Nuclear Arms and the Emerging International Order, Planning the Unthinkable, New Powers and Their Doctrines for Using Chemical, Biological, and Nuclear Weapons, Rockets' Red Glare, National Missile Defense and the Future of World Politics, Over the Horizon, Proliferation Threats. As you can see, he writes about mostly very cheerful subjects. His work on intelligence, deterrence, the Vietnam War, and military innovation and strategy has been published in Air Power Journal, Annual Review of Political Science, Astropolitics, the Harvard International Review, Homeland Security Affairs. You get the idea. And I should add Orbis, of course, FPRI's Orbis. Dr. Wirtz consults and has consulted with Navy Strategic Systems Program Officers, U.S. Strategic Command, the Department of Energy, the agency, as in CIA, Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories, and many others. So it's a very great pleasure to introduce this expert to you. Dr. Wirtz.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And because of that introduction, I guess it's beholden on me to say that I'm not speaking for any of those agencies, including the Navy or DOD, but, well, that's what it's, especially since it's being recorded. But it's a pleasure being here. And, you know, I also wanted to thank you personally for your hard work with a very tough demographic. I've got a 15-year-old right now who's getting barely, we're working on that B and AP world history, and it's a real struggle. You know, I was saying before, I could have swore that essay on the Roman Empire was an A, but he only got a B, but I tried, so that was the best I could do. So it's a really demanding class, and you guys really do a lot for those students. You know, we at the PG school, you know, I spend most of my time, you know, with fully funded grad ed, where the students are adults, they're, you know, officers about the 03 rank, Navy lieutenants, Army captains, and they're being paid to go there. So that's a far more motivated group, and, you know, if they don't do well, it really kind of destroys their career. But, you know, in a way, we have a lot in common with you in one sense, is that, you know, we really have to help these students learn as much as they can. If somebody tries, we really work to get them through it. It's not like a normal graduate school. If you're not the sharpest tool in the shed, they'll say, get lost, I'm not interested in working with you. So we really work with them and try to help them. And we get about 90% of them through, so that's pretty positive. But, so, you know, maybe we do share something in common, even though it is a different demographic. Well, today, I was asked to talk about nuclear and missile threats since 1991. And, you know, when I put the title on, my title for this, and I realized it was a different title, was current missile and, you know, current nuclear proliferation and missile threats. That's the political science way of saying it. This is the historian's way of saying it, right? So it's a historian's title. But the talk stayed the same. In thinking about this, and I have been thinking about this a little while, what are the trends? You know, as a political scientist, I want to explain what's going on. What are the causal factors? What's moving us in certain directions? In fact, what directions are we being moved in? And the real question is the cup half full or half empty? In thinking about this, and I'm a big supporter of nuclear deterrence, and I think there are positive things come out of nuclear deterrence. But, you know, I think we're in a period of nuclear disarmament. I think what we're witnessing in the world since the end of the Cold War is nuclear disarmament. And I'll qualify that, but I think that's actually occurring. It's also, when I say this, though, disarmament advocates would get really mad at me, because there is no plan for disarmament. There is no treaty for disarmament. It's just unfolding, and it's unfolding because people all over the world are making decisions on a day-to-day basis that slowly but surely, for the most part, are moving us farther and farther away from nuclear weapons and a reliance on nuclear weapons. Okay? So that's what I really want to talk about. I'll talk a little more about decoupling. Nuclear weapons are being decoupled from world politics in most parts of the world. I'll then talk about three nuclear trends that are out there, 3 trends in nuclear, and more or less the missile proliferation piggybacks on that. We'll talk a little bit about some current developments in missile proliferation, and then I'll get back to the original theme. Is this really nuclear disarmament? And I'll think about this. Now, I'm a child of the Cold War, and when I was the age your students are, 14, 15, 16-year-olds in a classroom, I had a profound and personal fear of nuclear war. Does anybody ever have that fear in here? You old people. The young people, this is like, what are you talking about? Right? But, I really went to sleep at night when I was in high school, or maybe actually a little younger, I think I became aware of this. In fact, I went on a field, once when I was about 12, my parents took me to Washington, and I really thought, man, I was at ground zero and we were going to get it while I was there, right? But we really did live under this nuclear shadow. And there was probably a lot of good reasons to be afraid of it, and you'll see some of the data I have up here. But we really did live under a nuclear sword of Damocles, and it was a fear that was with us all the time. And there was a real distinct and profound and obvious path towards nuclear war. It was a real possibility. I think since the end of the Cold War, we've moved away from that. I don't go to sleep at night thinking I'm going to die in a nuclear war. Okay, I think that I don't worry so much about that anymore. But there was a time we really worried about that. So what's happened? Well, this is the decoupling argument. And I came up with this thinking about trying to explain what's at work. And it comes out of network theory, which is an emerging sort of field of social and computer science, which tries to explain catastrophic or cascade failures across networks. And the idea is the more closely coupled individual parts of a network are, the way they interact maybe in unexpected ways, and the more highly interconnected, highly dependent, highly involved it all is, the more likely you are to get a catastrophic failure across a network, right? I mean, the electric grid is an example. You take out one transformer, you bring down the East Coast sort of problems. I mean, which is actually a real problem. So how closely coupled are these things? Allows for a propagation of problems across the entire system that could really, produce a failure where the sum is greater than just the sum of its parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Well, if you begin to decouple nuclear weapons for world politics, the likelihood that nuclear weapons will actually be used diminishes. So how are they being decoupled? Well, I think that nuclear weapons are losing strategic relevance at the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, nuclear weapons were used to deter, U.S. nuclear weapons were used to deter Soviet nuclear attacks against the U.S. and vice versa. They're used to deter Soviet attacks against American allies in NATO or Asia. And the idea here is deterrence, is that if they attacked us, we could retaliate in kind and actually defeat them. So during the Cold War, with nuclear weapons, the system was defensive dominant. In other words, no matter what you did, the other side could guarantee you would lose. I mean, we'd both lose, but you would lose too. And the idea there is that states generally don't start wars that they know they're going to lose. In fact, earlier we were talking about states start wars that they think they could win them cheaply and quickly. You can't do that with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons also take the guesswork out of war. At a couple points today, where there were paradoxes or quandaries or issues emerged because didn't the other side know they were going to lose the war? Well, in conventional war, it's never quite clear. Maybe you can have a better strategy, maybe you have better tactics, maybe you have better operations or better equipment or put it all together better. But I'll tell you, when 10,000 nuclear weapons go off, no strategy, there's no idea is going to save that. The results of a nuclear detonation are known in advance, and there's nothing you're going to do to alter that. No matter how good a soldier you are, how good your equipment is, how much you practice, it's just not going to matter, right? A 1 megaton nuclear weapon airburst will kill 50% of the people with a circle of radius 5 miles promptly. I mean, whoever's in there, half of them are going to be dead. There's nothing you can do about it. That's people living underground too. They're going to be dead too. I mean, that's just the way it is. Okay. So Those weapons were centerpiece in the Cold War struggle with the Soviets. But at the end of the Cold War, all of a sudden, the need for them seemed politically to diminish. And what you get is a lack of political support in the United States right now for nuclear weapons. And you have two nuclear posture reviews. It's not National Public Radio, it's Nuclear Posture Review. But the Bush administration, George W. in 2002 put together a nuclear posture review, which there are elements are actually contained in Obama's nuclear posture review. But what Bush wanted to do is he wanted to de-emphasize the role of nuclear weapons. He wanted missile defense, greater integration of all the precision, global precision strike, all this precision stuff. He wanted that included in the deterrence. And he also wanted money to study new kinds of nuclear warheads to hold at risk underground bunkers and people who are developing chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons, hold those kinds of targets at risk. What did the U.S. Congress say about that funding for that study? It was just a study to study it. What did they say? They said, hell no. No way. This is just a dodge to stop denuclearization and elimination of nuclear weapons. Didn't give them a nickel for it. The Obama National Posture Review asked for money to support the nuclear infrastructure for what reason? Does anybody know? What do you say? Not energy, to further nuclear disarmament. In other words, the argument is unless we keep our hand in the nuclear game, we won't have leverage, knowledge, know-how, expertise to facilitate nuclear disarmament in the long haul. So the document that actually supports the U.S. nuclear doctrine is actually a doctrine in support of eventual nuclear disarmament. That's a pretty big change. Now, I don't know if you can talk Congress out of getting money to eliminate weapons they kind of want to eliminate anyway, is another story. But that was the strategy contained in that. But you can see there's really no political support in the American body politic for a robust and growing nuclear program. In fact, changes in the U.S. military in terms of plans, these things are less integrated in war plans than they used to be. In terms of operations, we don't practice with them really anymore. And in terms of deployment, most of these things are not, for example, during the Cold War, B-52s were kept on strip alert. In fact, for a time during the Cold War, they kept an airborne alert. American nuclear bombers in the 50s, maybe early 60s, actually flew figure eights above the American Midwest armed with nuclear weapons, just so they wouldn't be caught on the ground in a Soviet attack. What do you think of that? Good idea? Bad idea? What do you think? Is that good? Yeah, what goes up must come down, huh? Yeah, I mean, it's really risky, but you could see how the threat we faced, that they were willing to take that risk. Today, if you said something like that, they'd think you're nuts. There's no way you do that. It's crazy. In fact, there's an incident that occurred that people really did think it was crazy. It was nuts, right? So all of those changes are occurring, that they're really being taken out of the force. Right now, the bombers no longer stand strip alert. They're no longer armed with nuclear weapons parked on airfields. The bombers and the weapons are actually deployed at different airfields. So if you actually wanted to load them up with nuclear weapons and put them on alert, it would take a period of what? What do you think? Hours, minutes, days, weeks? Well, not years, but it'd take hours. Yeah, and I hope these people have practiced it, which gets into the operational part, and I'm not so sure they have. Right? So there's really a de-emphasis on this. In terms of the nuclear program in the U.S. and a lot of other countries right now, nuclear modernization or even the modernization of delivery systems really are it's a no-growth industry. It's in stasis. It's simply not a growth industry in most parts of the world today. Right? The U.S. does not have a program to develop new nuclear weapons. There are plans on the works to modernize the intercontinental ballistic missile force. Some talk about a B-3 bomber, but these are projects that are years, decades down the road. So there's not a lot of emphasis in these sort of things. The other thing which occurred, CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That really was a disarmament effort that is sort of, when I say that in American government circles, they don't like it. What the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty does is it's a ban for no nuclear testing. If you don't test nuclear weapons, it destroys the living art of nuclear weapons manufacturing. Right? Right now, for example, there are more Pakistani scientists with experience, nuclear scientists, engineers with experience testing a nuclear weapon than there are U.S. nuclear scientists and engineers with experience testing a nuclear weapon, right? It destroys living art. Do you know what a living art is? Living art? The Saturn V was a living art. Professor McDougall, help me. Yeah. Oh, you never? Well, see, what the art is that, yeah, no, you have to, you can only write so much down in a blueprint. That when you go to build a nuclear weapon or engineer it, it's sort of, there's an apprentice system. The senior engineers have the junior engineers, and as you work on the problem, you assemble the weapon, you work on it. There are certain things that aren't written down in the blueprints that why is it done this way? Oh, it's done this way to avoid certain problems, avoid this, avoid that. You have to, it's a living art because it's passed down from generation to generation. As you stop weapons production, the old engineers and scientists die off and retire, and the new ones have never done it before. So there's elements of knowledge that are lost because it's not passed down over time. I mean, it's simple as that. So that has a that slowly but surely deteriorates your capability to make a nuclear weapon over time. And then there's also broader sociological factors. In the U.S. military, never really liked nuclear weapons. Okay, there was never a lot of love lost for them. Maybe small parts in the Air Force with the Air Force bombers, Curtis LeMay, the Strategic Air Command, but the Navy never liked it much. Army didn't like it. The Air Force mostly didn't like it. They didn't like these weapons because they were really difficult to handle and control. You had tons and tons of paperwork, documentation, training. They were a real hassle, and if you didn't get it right, it would ruin your career. They just didn't like it. The other thing, if you think about it, you would go on, let's say, in a missile command or in the bomber force, and you would spend your entire career sitting at the end of a runway, for example, for the bombers, in North Dakota in January, waiting to take off. How much fun is that, right? And by the way, you couldn't practice that takeoff because he only gave you odds of maybe 70% of making it, so why bother? On a snowy runway in the middle of winter, trying to get that bomber off fully loaded with a full load of fuel, a full nuclear load when it's snowing. You see, it's just not a lot of fun. So you'd spend your career sitting in a shack at the end of a runway. Didn't like it. The sociological factors now are even more intense. In fact, my colleague Avner Cohen said, the hardware will last longer than the sociology. Because what this now means is this is a dead-end career and that people don't really want to be participating in it anymore, right? There's no growth industry. There's nowhere to go. The national labs have a tough time attracting junior people because what are you going to, you're going to be a nuclear scientist in a national lab. Well, you're not building a weapon. You're not testing a weapon. What exactly are you going to be doing there? Why is this of any importance? Who cares? Why do it? Same sort of thing could apply to the nuclear realm where the military, officers just don't see this as important as something you want to do. A recent example. This is, you noticed in the news about 2 months ago that Air Force officers who were running ICBMs, right, they're in launch control officers, were cheating on their tests. This is a question they were asked on the test. You could read it. What they were actually using was a gouge sheet. You ever heard that term before, gouge sheet? Well, in the government, you have a lot of training you got to go through, and a lot of it is admittedly mindless. Well, here I'm self-incriminating again, but hey, I have to take laser pointer safety, right? Don't point the laser pointer at people's eyes. I mean, come on, right? So if you had a gouge sheet saying, how powerful could a laser be before it hits someone in the eyes? Well, I know not to do it anyway. It doesn't really matter. But so people would come equipped with the training with gouge sheets, with all the answers. These guys had a gouge sheet. Now, do you want nuclear missile operators to use a gouge sheet when they're answering a question like this? Well, take a look. What it's saying is that there's a maintenance team out on the line, and you get an alarm. What do? There's an alarm from a silo they're not supposed to be in. Who do you call? Now, why would people do that? Why would they use a gouge sheet? Why do people use gouge sheets? Because they what? Why do you think? They want to be perfect, or they think that what they're doing isn't
relevant.
Relevant or all that important. That's pretty bad. Right? That's an example of the sociology beginning to crumble. So, does that make you feel better already? Why, this is just in the news a couple of months ago. Now, for what it's worth, we've actually offered to run short courses like this for these officers, explaining to them why what they're doing is important, but that's a bit of marketing. So, saved the... Yeah. No, it's, basically it's just saying, who do you call when you get an alarm? I don't know. Hey, you got a 1 in 4 shot. I don't know, it's like the AP test. Do the two you know are wrong and take a guess. What?
Have they dismantled the system where they have to get every question correct?
Oh, I don't know. Did they do?
They were being required to get every single question right, which is why there was a cheating scandal.
That would prompt a gouge sheet, too. Okay. Yeah, that could be. Could be. But do you want the guys running these missile silos to have a perfect knowledge of running a nuclear weapon? I think that's important. I mean, That's what all the questions are really about. Oh yeah, no, this is I'm sure this is what this is like. Oh yeah. Well, this is a safety and security question. Right? This is what this is. This is safety and security. If there's some, you're getting an internal alarm that there's some activity where there shouldn't be, what do you do? So this could be, Al-Qaeda coming here, or it could be, you've got a dangerous problem, a fire, a leak, somebody's not where they're supposed to be, intruder. So, along the same lines, when nuclear weapons is a diminishing asset, this is an incident that occurred a few years earlier where a B-52 crew from Minot was flying to Shreveport, and what they were going to do is take 6 advanced air-launched cruise missiles they were going to fly them down there, and they were going to be disassembled or put into storage or whatever. The problem is they just didn't carry the cruise missiles. What did they carry? Nuclear weapons. They were nuclear armed, and the crew didn't know it. That's not good either, is it? No. That's another example of the sociology. Now, during the Cold War, there were nuclear accidents. Bombers crashed that were loaded with nuclear weapons. There was a Titan missile fire. Somebody dropped a wrench in it. There was a fire, right? Arkansas, yes. So there were accidents. I think there's still a nuclear weapon lost someplace in North Carolina. But in Spain, off the coast of Spain, but nothing like this happened. They didn't upload nuclear weapons and not keep track of it. I mean, this is sort of a lack of attention to detail that I believe shows the slow failure of the sociology. Okay, so here's the first trend. Nuclear weapons is a diminishing asset. Now, this is sort of also supports we are in a realm of nuclear disarmament. Here you got the combined number of nuclear weapons worldwide. This is probably an approximation. I'm sure it is. Just took it off the web, but it looks about right to me. So the trend since 1990, you can see when I was a child in 1970, you could see why in this time frame you'd be kind of worried. You can see why now I'd say, well, maybe I have a little bit less to worry about. I mean, that trend is pretty clear in suggesting, what does it suggest to you? Are we looking at nuclear disarmament here? No? Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a big difference. In fact, now disarmament advocates would say, oh no, it's not nuclear disarmament. You're not at zero. But I would say, getting from 65,000 to zero, you've got to pass through 12,000, right? And subject to the law of diminishing returns, that last drop from 2005 to 2012 shows it really hasn't kicked in yet. If you have it every time, you never get to zero, but I think that's a pretty impressive decline. These are some of the, when you move beyond the Soviets, the Russians, and the U.S., we've got the Brits, French, Israelis, South Africans, Indians, Pakistan, and I think that little blue line down the bottom must be North Korea, okay? But you can even see there that those arsenals, for the most part, are in decline or are stable. The French are a little ahead of the Brits, which makes sense. I think that, that Chinese number looks pretty good. South Africans are gone. Indians and Pacs, you can see, are locked in a bit of an arms race there. They're a growth industry there. But the rest of it is actually pretty stable, which shows that for the most part, it's not really a growth industry. It's either not a growth industry or in decline from the other nuclear powers. This is what we've got by treaty. This is, Moscow Treaty, the New START. So, and in fact, some critics would say arms control now acts as a floor, not a ceiling to nuclear armaments, because you can see that the Russians, in terms of deployed weapons, are sort of building up as we build down. And, the bottom line is the number of delivery systems associated with those nuclear weapons. So you can see the numbers. But those are just a fraction of the nuclear weapons we had pointed at each other 20 years ago, which were, about 10,000. They had about 10,000. We had about 10,000. And it's really incredible the way the numbers have come down. What do you think about the difference between the number? Do we get an advantage? What advantage do we get by having more delivery systems than they do? What do you think? You know? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Harder to knock them out. What are you going to say? Oh, okay. Use your microphone. No. Actually, we have demerved our land-based missiles, and that's actually the point of the question. See, does everybody know what a MIRV is? Okay, a multiple independently targetable reentry vehicle. An ICBM sometimes has one warhead on it, but sometimes it could have 3 warheads on it, or 5, or 10, or 15, or 20. The problem is that those 20 missiles in the ground those 20 warheads on that missile in the ground are a tempting target, because you're tempting the other side to launch 2 warheads at your missile in the ground, so you could destroy those 20 warheads with 2 warheads. A conservative military planner would use 2 warheads and not 1, okay, to make sure you took it out. Okay, you could have a failure in the system, or some sort of system, or whatever. So when you demerve, you only put 1 warhead on a missile. The other side's going to have to fire 2 warheads to destroy your warhead. So that actually makes it survivable, increases its survivability. So in a way, you would want more delivery vehicles, because it complicates the targeting problem from the other side. Fewer, you put more eggs in one basket. More delivery vehicles, you put fewer eggs in one basket. Which does it cost more to do? Well, it costs to have more money to have more delivery vehicles, right? It's cheaper to have the MIRV to put 3 warheads on the 1 missile. So, but that's what the force structures sort of look like out to 2018. And finally, this is the number of warheads in both the arsenals, and what the trend's been since 1960. And what you see there is a rather large proportion of these warheads are actually taken out of service in storage and awaiting dismantlement, which is a slow and complicated process in itself. It's not something you just take the thing apart with a screwdriver. One problem here for the next round of arms control is the non-strategic nuclear warheads. You can see the disparity is that the Russians actually have a large number of tactical nuclear weapons that are not really covered by treaty. And sort of the next round of arms control has to focus on those non-strategic systems to get them down. We've pretty much eliminated our tactical nuclear weapons deployments. There are some weapons deployed as part of the NATO deterrent in Europe, but nuclear weapons are being moved from U.S. Navy back in 1991 with the Bush administration. So most of our battlefield nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons are no longer deployed. Possibly be redeployed, but that would probably take longer than weeks. Probably measured in months. So those are sort of the broad trends with nuclear weapons. And, I really do think this is what disarmament would look like. This is what disarmament looks like. This is it, right? There isn't a fancy plan to go along with it. There isn't a big apology for what went in the past that goes along with it. But I think the trends are pretty clear. They're pretty robust, and they've resisted some pretty strong insults. Okay, so that's trend number one. Trend number two, the problem cases. Well, this is actually the problem cases right now. We've got the Koreans, Iranians, and India and Pakistan. Now, India and Pakistan are really, as you saw in that one chart with the growth of nuclear weapons, really are locked in a nuclear arms race, and it's not a balanced one. The Indians want to use their conventional superiority, and what they want to do is, in the face of Pakistani aggression or to retaliate for some Pakistani injustice, they want to do a quick cross-border armored raid into Pakistan, seize territory, and then sort of hold it and negotiate with the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis want to stop this by integrating tactical nuclear weapons into their conventional forces, so that as soon as the Indians come across the border, I guess the Pakistani nuclear doctrine is to let them have it as they come across. The Indians tend to see nuclear weapons more as a weapon of last resort. They're not really integrated into conventional forces as much, but the Pacs really do work hard on integrating these things into their conventional operations. So that's one problem. Another problem is North Korea. Now, the problem with North Korea isn't as much that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons, is what will their neighbors do, right? If current trends continue, when will the North Korean activity be so provocative that will force or cause the Japanese, South Koreans, or the Taiwanese to acquire nuclear weapons, right? That's really the fear. And right now, the U.S. has a policy of extended deterrence for Japan, Korea, and to a certain extent Taiwan, vis-a-vis Korea. Do the Japanese, Koreans, or Taiwanese believe we will retaliate with nuclear weapons or threaten Korea with nuclear weapons in the face of Korean nuclear aggression? That's the $64,000 question that's hanging fire out there. And to the extent we can convince the Japanese or the Koreans, South Koreans, that will do that, that'll sort of diminish their desire to acquire nuclear weapons. But if they begin to doubt that, then they might decide to buy their own nuclear arsenals, create their nuclear arsenals. Now, is there anything that I just said in the previous trend? What does the previous trend say for this problem? What do you think? Does this, well, it's actually this one. Does this reassure them?
No.
No.
I think it shows a limit to the first trend, that you can't get below a certain number. Otherwise, you're all threatened by the other problems. And in addition, the comment about South Korea, how willing would South Korea even want the U.S. to be able to use a nuclear weapon on North Korea?
Didn't Japan just recently start talking about removing the part of their constitution that says that they will not produce or have nuclear weapons in country?
Well, you could go ahead.
It's more about removing Article 9 in terms of going from strictly defense force to a more mobile force rather than the nuclear side of it. But that would be the next follow-up.
Because I would figure that if the Japanese, South Koreans, or Taiwanese ever get to the point where they feel the United States will not deter the North Koreans, that I don't see any of those countries just sitting back and saying, oh, let's have North Koreans have a nuclear weapon.
No, that's the fear. And what's happened in Japan over the last 10 years, 20 years ago, if you were a Japanese politician and said, oh, I think we should get nuclear weapons, you'd be thrown out of office. Now you can actually raise those sorts of issues and debate them publicly. It's a big change. Yeah, because of North Korea. So, but see, these trends, our allies who depend on our extended deterrence guarantees are beginning to point to some of these trends and saying, well, what does this mean for us? How are you going to solve our problems? How you deter regional attacks in our regions with as you diminish? The Iranian issue is the same, is even more complicated. there's problems in terms of the Israelis. The Israelis aren't real big believers in deterrence, right? They just aren't. Americans are big believers in deterrence. Israelis really aren't big believers in deterrence, and they are not willing to. They say they're not willing to tolerate an Iranians armed with nuclear weapons, right? And sometimes they scream at us that, and you promised you wouldn't do it either, right? So that's a problem here. Will this force prompt the Israelis to launch preventive war against Iran to go after their nuclear capabilities before they come up? It also, extended deterrence raises its ugly head again, because if you're going to say you have allies there, maybe not so much the Israelis, but what about Saudi Arabia or Turkey? And Turkey is a NATO ally. If the Iranians get nuclear weapons, what sort of extended deterrent guarantees is the U.S. willing to now extend to the Saudis or to Turkey? There's another issue I actually didn't write up here, is that you get this problem of the nuclear cascade. Is the same with the Koreans, but here you got the Sunni-Shia dispute is sort of merged into this, and from the Gulf states' perspective, from people sort of from the Saudis or the Iranian perspective, this sort of looks like the final Sunni-Shia showdown. Say that 3 times fast, right? This is it. This is the main event is coming, and as soon as the Iranians get that weapon, now we're really going to settle this thing once and for all. The Saudis, are just not going to. They're not going to live on an Iranian nuclear shadow. They're just not, and they have money to do something about it. So who would, where are they going to get a weapon? Would they get a weapon? How would they get the weapon remains to be seen. But you could see there's going to be real incentives here for other states to arm themselves with nuclear weapons if the Iranians are allowed to get that weapon. So it's imperative for the world to sort of hold this at bay, to stop it as much as we possibly can. Because otherwise, this thing will take on a life of its own, I believe, in a regional context. I mean, we don't have I think a dog in that Sunni-Shia fight, really. But these people really do, and they see it through that lens. Does that make sense? But now, these are not non-proliferation trends. These are proliferation trends. This is where nuclear war could return in a big way. So that's sort of that's the cup half empty. Okay, the third trend is what's often referred to in the literature as the nuclear renaissance. The problem we face is that the only viable medium-term solution we have to global warming is nuclear power. The only way we can get off carbon is nukes in the next 30 or 40 years. It's the only technology we have that's going to generate the power we need in the medium term. Now, the good news is that nuclear reactors are getting safer, new reactor designs. The bad news, though, is that more states are going to be acquiring this technology in the not-too-distant future, and there's a proliferation risk and a security risk. Will highly enriched uranium fall into the wrong hands? Will plutonium fall into the wrong hands? Will spent nuclear materials fall into the wrong hands? Does the world have the right safeguards and security in place to stop this from happening? So in a way that even though the reliance on nuclear weapons might be diminishing in most parts of the world, the nuclear know-how, technology, and materials are going to proliferate in the years ahead. If you look at the next slide, it's actually very interesting. You got nuclear electricity generation in 2010. So the vertical side is the percentage of your electricity you get from nukes, and the breadth of it is how much you're actually generating. So you can see the French went into nuclear energy in a big way, right? 20% of our nuclear power, our electrical power is nuclear generated, right? Japanese, 30%. What's really interesting, though, is you come here, the Chinese and Indians are down, it's like 2 or 3%. And they don't make a lot of electricity. So do you think China's going to make more electricity in the years ahead? What kind of electricity are they going to make? Coal. If they make it out of coal, oh, we are dead. We are done. I've never been to Beijing, but I've been to New Delhi, let me tell you. Good Canadian coal in New Delhi? Oh, yeah. You know, the problem is that they don't, you know, you're making electricity or heating homes with coal, and it makes one smoky mess. And the amount of pollution being kicked into the atmosphere, if you look at what they're generating, they've got nowhere to go but up. If it's not nuclear, you know, the environment just won't sustain it. So there's going to be a growth. I mean, nuclear is the way ahead for the next 30 or 40 years. It's going to be the greatest growth in two of the countries, well, at least one of the countries, India, that we're worried about, Pakistan too. Well, that's an issue out there. How are we going to handle all this? So there'll be more nuclear power plants, more nuclear generation out there. And what are you going to do with all that? In fact, there has to be. If we don't, we'll, you know, the environmental degradation is just going to be incredible. Now, I was also asked to talk about missile proliferation. And, you know, thinking about this, you know, in terms of the U.S., Chinese, Russian sides, you know, missile advancement is relatively slow, moderate, not a lot of money. It occurs, but in terms of missile modernization, but it's really all at a modest pace. What you really see the changes are in our four problem actors. Now, what I have here is this beautifully decorated Agni 3 solid fuel, two-stage, 4,500 kilometer range, 2,490 kilogram throw weight nuclear missile. They tested it in a rail mobile mode. You can put it in a submarine. This is pretty the circular error probable. The odds of a warhead from this thing landing within a circle of 120 feet has a 50-50 chance of putting a warhead in a circle of 120 feet. Circular error probable, 50-50 chance of shot in radius. What was the CEP on a B-17? We were talking about World War II bombing. What was the circular error probable on a B-17? What do you think? Miles, 5 miles. B-17 had a SEP of 5 miles. The odds of the bomb landing within a circle you're aiming at was 5 miles. So. Anything else from this picture? What do you think of that? What do you think about the way the Indians have brought this thing out? What does it tell you? What does it tell you about that missile in India? People behind it. What are people doing? Cheering. They like it, don't they? They like their missile. You could also tell they like their missile how? What? It's big. Okay, fair enough. Big is good. Big is good. Look how nicely painted it is. They have the flag on it. They got a nice camouflage paint job. It's a beautiful thing of beauty. So, in fact, ORDO is the organization that manufactured it. They're proud of it too. It's not the truck manufacturer. Yeah, ORDO is it's India's sort of Lawrence Livermore Rand Corporation and Boeing all put into one is what it really is. So, but you can see there's a lot of national pride in the thing. There's a lot of public interest in it. Now that missile could not be fired from that truck. That's just a transport. That's actually a parade. It's actually a float. It's the best way to look at the thing. Oh, they made the float out of the thing, but you can't fire the missile from that. It's not really the transport or erector launcher, and it's probably not as road mobile as it appears here. Well, there's the range of the thing. So who are they going to point this at? Who is this for? No, that's the missile they don't have. It's the inner ring is the missile they do have. Who are they aiming this thing at? Who do you think? Yes.
Pakistan
China.
and China.
This is the one for China. This is the whole targets at risk in China. Yeah. So this is to hold Chinese targets at risk. Now, here is the PACs. Now, it's really the first three missiles is the one that's on this list. You know, they've basically what they've done, and it's actually something very interesting from this slide too. I don't know if you can read it. This is where the missiles come from. We've got domestic production, Chinese domestic production, and North Korean domestic production. A lot of these missiles are variants of Soviet Scud missiles that were delivered to Soviet allies during the war. That there was internal production in the countries, for example, China or North Korea, and then this technology is now spread. So there actually is a missile technology network sharing technology out there. There was an article written by called Proliferation Rings that talked about different proliferation networks sharing this kind of technology. But if you look at it, the range here is a lot shorter. I think we're only talking about here. That inner ring here is as far as it goes. So the PACs are pointing this thing at who? India. So there you can see what they have, what they're interested in. Now, you could read, this is actually a very strange development. What the PACs have done is really spent more and more time on really developing and integrating their nuclear weapons into their conventional force. I already mentioned that. But some of the weapons they're building are really sort of strange. They're actually very short-range nuclear systems, right? Now, did anybody else ever have short-range nuclear systems? Yes. That's right. Can you name one?
John.
Honest John. What was the Pershing?
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett. Does anybody, you ever hear of the Davy Crockett? You've never heard? Davy Crockett was a 105 millimeter recoilless rifle.
I believe, and is it the Davy Crockett that had a blast radius that was bigger than its effective range?
Yes, you gave Davy Crockett was a recoilless. It was a recoilless rifle. I want to say 105 millimeter. So it was a crew-served weapon. 3 guys. You'd turn the thing over in the field to what rank? Corporal. Yeah, you give it to one of your students. So you're going to give one of your students this nuclear weapon. That's what it was. On a 105 millimeter recoilless rifle, had I think a 0.3 kiloton nuclear warhead, and the lethal radius was farther than the thing would shoot. So the crew would be killed with the blast. Right? Now, why would they give these kids this weapon? Stop Soviet tanks. It gave you the artillery power of a divisional artillery shoot. You give that to a corporal. So the orders are, when you see that tank division heading at you, when they're in range, fire. But what does that do? Well, wait a minute. You're giving what to who? Under what circumstances? Can you guarantee that thing will be fired? Can you guarantee it won't be fired? Can you guarantee it won't go off at all? Or will go off? That's right. Well, see, a lot. People have said that some of the PAC nuclear doctrine is just mirroring U.S. nuclear doctrine with NATO during the, in the books they use to study it is all U.S. Army doctrine. It's all U.S. Army manuals. So, but what they're saying here is that to counter Cold Start, what they're going to do is integrate and develop new missiles, this Nasser missile system, so that when the Indians come across in that Cold Start doctrine to try to seize territory, what they're going to respond with immediately is nuclear weapons. And there it is. That's the Nasser 60-kilometer tactical nuclear weapons system. It has 4 missiles on it, 4 nuclear weapons. We talked to them about this. I've talked to them about this. And if you think about it, they say they're relatively small nuclear weapons at like the 0.3 kiloton level. So I don't know if they can actually build a weapon like that. But that's another story. But the problem is the lethal radius of that weapon isn't all that big, especially against an Indian armored formation that's going to be moving. General, how fast can you move an armored unit across a desert? Okay. Well, how are you going to, the lethal radius of this weapon against that armored formation, you got to really almost hit the armored formation. How are you going to hit an armored formation moving at 12 miles an hour? The targeting problem, I thought, was just impossible. I mean, it'd be hard for us to take a shot like that with it really would be. What are they going to do with this thing? So, you talk to them about it and say, what are you really going to do with this? I don't think they know. I don't think there's a good answer.
Well, I was going to say, wouldn't it be a saturation type defense where the minute they see India even coming towards the border, now you just saturate the border with these weapons, so that it basically creates a...
Yeah, but you know what? If you fired this thing off at a target in the middle of a desert, nothing's going to happen unless you hit the target.
All right.
It's just not a big warhead. It's not a lot of lethal radius. It's just not. I mean, you wouldn't want to be underneath it, but if you were a mile away from this in a tank, I think you'd be fine. Mile or two, no problem. 2 miles, no problem. You're not close enough. No. But this is being closely integrated into what now they're bragging about. This is being closely integrated into our conventional capability on a real-time basis. So now we've got, if these weapons are sort of forward deployed or out in the field, begin to have all kinds of problems. What kind of security do they have? Do they have permission action links? In other words, do the people who have the weapons actually have the capability to detonate them even though they don't have the order to do so? What sort of security is on it? Either security from outside forces or from the insider threat. So this is not necessarily a turn for the better. And the problem happens is you say, well, India, Pakistan, too bad. But what happens if it does go nuclear? What does that mean for us? Do we get involved? Do we stand aloof? I mean, will we get involved? Will we stand aloof? I don't know. Nobody knows the answer to these kind of questions. Okay. Up here, we've got the Iranians with their capability. So that's the next. These are typo dongs given to the Iranians, and you can begin to reach targets in, I guess, Canada. And, okay, that's about it. Okay, is this nuclear disarmament? Wrong color, wrong chart. But these are nuclear tests worldwide. So we've got U.S. is blue, France is kind of green, Soviets are red, PRC is purple, UK is yellow, India is orange, PAC's deeper orange, and the North Koreans are red. You see a couple red dots at the end? So, yeah. So you see if you look at this, you see the number of nuclear tests that were actually pretty stable for a long, long time. And then they fell off, and they fell off in 92. This is about when the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed. And the last tests, I think the French fired a few, and the U.S. did a few towards the end, too. But there hasn't been very much nuclear testing since 1992. You've just got the India and PAC tests there and the North Koreans after that. Okay. Okay, so my final points I leave you with, and to tell the students, is I think decoupling is occurring. I think among the nuclear powers we think most of, maybe that's the best way to call it, between the Chinese, the French, the Brits, the US, and the Russians, the nuclear realm really isn't much of a growth industry, okay? At most you have modest modernization, you have general sort of maintenance occurring, or just replacement on, for every 2 you lose, you replace with 1. It's very modest in a declining, it's not a growth industry, it's in decline, okay? That trend is actually very robust and resilient. If you look at the charts, it's been going on for about 25 years, right? And that's experienced some significant insults. It's experienced the insult of the Indian and Pakistan nuclear tests. It's resisted the insult of the North Korean nuclear test. It's resisted the insult of Second Gulf War, right? It's resisted. Nobody's talked much about spooling up the U.S. nuclear deterrent in the face of Russian aggression against the Ukraine. Nobody's mentioned that. So those trends are pretty resistant to those threats. The other thing, though, is none of this is planned. Okay, it's not planned. What's happening, I believe, is that politically, there's a broad political consensus around the world that nuclear weapons really don't do much for us anymore, right? And that they're not necessary. And under those circumstances, people will find other things literally to spend their money on. And this goes from everywhere, from the man in the street, man or woman in the street, to the Pentagon defense planner, to the politician, is that there's just no dollars, there's just no votes, there's just no action in the nuclear realm. And just as a natural progression from that, it slowly will wind down. In fact, it's all the U.S. military can do is to preserve the nuclear capability they have today in the face of a lack of budgetary support, lack of interest on the services, and really a lack of scientific support. The thing really is a dying enterprise. But are the causal forces unclear? I mean, that's my explanation. I might be right, I might be wrong. But what is really behind this? Is it easily reversed, right? If a nuclear weapon goes off tomorrow, would these trends be resilient, right? Some of my colleagues say, yes, they would be. In fact, it would accelerate disarmament. Others say, no, it won't be. It's going to turn things around like you wouldn't believe, and we'll be building nuclear bombs. I mean, I don't know. We don't know. Don't know. So, I don't know. Okay, hey, 3 books to leave you with that you might be interested in or the students might be interested in. First one would be as much for the students. This is the Sagan-Waltz debate. Ken Waltz recently passed away. One of the most highly cited theorists in international relations, and in fact, he was the leading theorist of the Cold War, and was a man who led me to expect, when he wrote this book in 1979, that pretty much the Cold War was going to go on for a long, long time, and you better hope it did, because the only way out was war. Okay, Waltz thought nuclear weapons, to do injustice to his argument, nuclear weapons are good because nuclear weapons are defensive dominant, and they force moderation on the part of great power behavior, make great power war less likely. So nuclear deterrence is good. Nuclear proliferation, on balance, might be a good thing, because what it did for the U.S. and the Soviets, it might do for everybody else. Scott Sagan, a colleague of mine at Stanford, says, no, wait a minute, that's not true. There's a lot of problems with nuclear weapons. Nuclear accidents, inadvertent nuclear use. You know, you can imagine the long list of things he can come up with. But that's a debate between the two of them. Students might be interested in this. It's reasonably acceptable for your seniors' hard charters, but you'd enjoy it too. Unlimited Nuclear War is a volume that I was recently involved in with 2 of my colleagues. I wrote the conclusion, but the premise here is, what happens if a nuclear weapon is used? And we assume that the next nuclear war would be a limited nuclear war. It's going to involve a few weapons, 1 to 2 to maybe a few hundred, but it's not going to be this worldwide Armageddon that we think of when we think of nuclear war. It's going to be a limited use of nuclear war, a few nuclear weapons. What happens under those circumstances? What are the incentives that states will face when they're facing these circumstances? Bottom line is, you're going to want to end the nuclear war as quickly as possible. So you want to limit it at 1 nuclear weapon being used. That's going to be the incentive. War termination will be the incentive, so it talks about that. The complex deterrence book is a little bit more theoretically adventurous. This talks about the role of deterrence in a world where there is a revolution in military affairs, where there is globalization, where publics play a part, where what's happened is that the ability to cause death and destruction is widely spread in the world today, but what's not spread in the world is credibility. There's a sort of an interest-threat mismatch where the other side doesn't believe you'll actually kill them for deterrence, right? They don't believe you're willing to shed blood, their blood or your blood, to actually achieve those deterrent threats. So it's really the manipulation of the willingness to take risks and to engage in warfare. There's really very little doubt about the capability to inflict death and destruction anymore. It's really doubt about your willingness to inflict death and destruction, which drives deterrence. And this is all playing out in front of a global audience where that politicians and military leaders are going to be There's going to be a lot of armchair quarterbacking in front of a global audience. This also unfolds on global audience in real time. Okay, thanks. Questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Wirtz. You provided a lot of illuminating data. One question you didn't talk about at all was nuclear terrorism.
Well, okay, nuclear terrorism, nuclear terrorism has been with us a long time. And the fear is that it could come out in a variety of ways. Nuclear terrorism could involve purloined, stolen nuclear materials and a dirty bomb. In other words, you put some sort of radiation dispersal device you get some radioactive material, you pack high explosive around it, you detonate it in an urban area, you irradiate it, you cause a real environmental problem, probably kill some people. But the lethal radius of that thing is not going to exceed pretty much the blast radius of the high explosive. Okay, so it can be relatively contained. There's another concern that terrorists could assemble a very low yield gun-type fission device, right? Basically what you need is a 105 millimeter artillery tube, right? Highly enriched uranium, right? You need, you need a nuclear material, and then you need to drive it together, which you do with a high explosive, and to get some fission out of the thing, right? You could, people, if you had the materials, a little bit of know-how, you could probably get a nuclear device that yield 1 or 2 to 10 kilotons. Whether or not that could be smuggled into the country or assembled indigenously largely depends on the availability of the nuclear material. That's a problem. It's a long-standing concern. There's also concern about people stealing nuclear weapons, stealing nuclear materials. I, for one, think there's probably nuclear material someplace in the former Soviet Union. At the end of the Soviet Union, people stole everything, the toilet fixtures out of factories. And there was a belief that nuclear materials would be purchased quickly on the black market. Now, today, most black market purchases of nuclear materials are made by intelligence agents from every country on the planet trying to corner that black market. But what it shows, that sends a good message. That sends a message that the nuclear material you have in your barn, don't try to sell it, you're going to be selling it to the police, right? But I do think that there's some nuclear material out there that people stole from these Russian operations, these Soviet operations, took home in the hopes that they would get rich, that is now just sitting there someplace. That's within the realm of possibility, right? So how closely safeguarded is this material? The Department of Energy puts out a monthly report on incidents related to nuclear materials being intercepted or found. There's stories, people trying to sell nuclear materials every once in a while. And there's the ever-popular story about red mercury. You know red mercury? You ever hear that one? That's an urban myth. Red mercury is supposed to be a secret ingredient in nuclear weapons. It's all this bunk. But people are getting killed fighting over red mercury because there is a black market for red mercury, which tells you there is a black market. The idea that you could sell this stuff, there's a market for it, is sort of out there. Now, what are the risks of nuclear terrorism unfolding this way? People have talked about this for well over a decade. It's on their minds. But, I don't know how seriously we take it anymore. I think if we really thought that there was a real risk that somebody was going to detonate a nuclear weapon in an American city and smuggle it into this country, we would not be here right now. We would be taking far more stringent security efforts, that sort of thing. But it's still out there. It's still a risk. It's still a possibility. That would have been the fourth trend, but I think it's there.
William Schmidek, Fox Lake, Illinois.
Thank you. One of the things I constantly hear from my sophomoric students who are sophomoric in age and mentality sometimes, their solution to everything is nuke them. Noticing the book that you wrote, the conclusion to unlimited nuclear war, which I guess would be different than unlimited nuclear war.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But I wrote down this question, is there an actual case for limited nuclear war that could happen? Do you foresee a possibility of it without it expanding?
Oh, no, very easily. Hey, there could be some... It's not as if jihadis don't blow up the Indian parliament. I mean, imagine if some terrorist group went in and blew up Congress while they were in session, or attacked them with machine guns or bombs or something. I mean, we'd be off. It's a good thing it's the Indians. We'd be off. I mean, we would do what we did. We'd invade Afghanistan, right? You wouldn't stop us from retaliating against that. If the Indians retaliate conventionally, maybe the Pax will go nuclear. They're saying they're going to go nuclear. They're developing capabilities to go nuclear. They're integrating it into their conventional force so they can go nuclear. Maybe they'll go nuclear. Now, there's an idea out there called the nuclear taboo, right? That nuclear weapons it's unthinkable that you could use nuclear weapons. So that there's this taboo out there which creates a fire break in all our minds that that prevents policymakers, military officers, citizens, whoever, that we have an aversion to nuclear weapons use and we will walk away from it always. People walk away from it. What do you think?
In an age where we're reducing nuclear weapons, I am fearful of the idea that there's somebody out there thinking this would be a good time to nuke somebody because we can get away with it. And the idea of a surprise use by one country against another, basically to wipe that country out, I mean, that's, right now I think, is more likely in some respects because of the fact that what do you have to lose?
Right. Well, what here, and this goes back to our RMA talk, is that an electromagnetic, nuclear weapons produce a lot of effects. One effect is electromagnetic pulse. It's when gamma radiation hits matter, sort of freestanding electrical field, and it fritzes out your electronics, right? What do we rely on in the U.S. military? Information revolution, that computer. I don't think my Mac is EMP hardened. I hope theirs is, right? Well, here's this key enabler for us, but one high altitude nuclear detonation produces EMP pulse. It's not going to kill anybody, but all of a sudden, if the electronics go down, what does that mean for us? Now we're really off to the races. We got a real problem here because we were counting on that information dominance that now is gone. The satellites are blinded. The communications are down. The computers don't work. You could use it that way.
Richard Vandenbosch from Modesto, California.
First of all, I must say I'm envious of your proximity to Del Monte Beach. That happens to be my favorite beach. Question, being that you believe that the nuclear threat is diminished, what do you see as the greatest threat to domestic security here in the United States? What do you see as the as a real possible threat? I mean, are you the grid system? What do you see?
Domestically?
Yeah, domestically.
Well, when you talk about nuclear terrorism, maybe terrorism against a nuclear power plant would be something you'd want to consider, or a chemical plant. What I think 9/11 showed us is that Al-Qaeda was willing to use the materials on site to create the death and destruction. If you see all the presentations you've seen, we don't do that. The U.S. military doesn't do that. In part because you can't control the destruction that occurs. In part, there may be good business reasons not to do it, right? But the bottom line is that will opponents use the high energy systems, toxic systems, that we live with and interact with on a daily basis? Will they somehow try to use those against us? So on 9/11, they captured the kinetic energy in the transportation network, used the planes to take down the World Trade Center. Okay. But you could have tried to driven that into a nuclear power plant. Now, I guess the containment vessels are made to stop that from happening, but hey, nobody's tested it with the 757 yet, I guess. But no, those are sort of, or a chemical plant, those kinds of problems. A lot of the cyber threat is related to the electric network. Question is how long can the U.S. military operate if the domestic electric network is brought down? Once again, there goes the information dominance, et cetera, et cetera. Then how do you bring the thing back up? If you know anything about electric generation in the U.S., it's lucky the lights are on at all. Right? The voltage has to be constantly adjusted by those guys at a power plant, right? Up and down all day long. So as demand goes up, you better make some more electricity or the whole thing will come down. So that's got to be adjusted in real time. How do you bring it all back up? And who gets up first? Do you bring up the hospital or do you bring up the Boeing plant? Right? I mean, you need the Boeing plant. We need the parts.
Wallace Goodman from Austin, Texas.
For a long time, I told my students that the South Korea-North Korea border was the most dangerous, but that now I'm not sure. So if you had to rank Pakistan, India versus South Korea, North Korea, which is more dangerous?
You know, that's a good question. It depends on which day of the week you ask it, right? No, there have been times where I think right now probably the Korea is pretty dangerous. I mean, they're shooting back and forth at each other right now. What's dangerous in India, when I was talking to Indians about this, what they're worried about is, India is it's a very strange conflict between India and Pakistan because it was all one, British. Yes, come on, AP. That's in chapter what in AP? What year? But what you have there is a very strange situation where the Indians think that Pax really screwed everything up, right? You would have had all of South Asia, would have been one greater India. It would have been the multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious state that it is today. And they just hacked it apart because they couldn't get with the program. We couldn't all be South Asians together and move on into our glorious spot as a rising great power. So there's a resentment the Indians have towards the Pax for ruining everything. The Pax are nervous because they know the Indians resent them for ruining everything, and they think sooner or later they're going to set the matter straight, reunite the place, and march off into history. So that makes them very nervous. On the other hand, the Indians are worried that the Pax keep attacking them and they don't do much. Right? There was a Mumbai raid. Now, of course, the Pax say, well, we didn't do it, it was just these nutty jihadis. But, there's a lot of debate about how closely that is actually linked with elements in the Pakistani government. But, you've got the, brass tacks, you've got fighting in Kashmir over the variety of fighting in Kashmir, major incidents in Kashmir. You've got, incidents over exercises. You've got the Mumbai attacks. You've got the parliamentary attacks. So on the other hand, the Indians are worried, is deterrence really working, or are the Pax being emboldened, and where's this all going to go? So there's a lot of tension there too. You've got an arms race going on. You've got one side integrating nuclear weapons into their conventional forces in a big way. You've got the other side, the Indians have a mistrust of their military that goes back to the colonial days. So there's really an arm's length distance the politicians like to keep between the Indian military and Indian nuclear weapons. So this is going to be very interesting to see how it plays out, if it plays out. But I think both places there's some tension there. What really bothers me is if that happens, if there's a nuclear event in Korea and a nuclear event in Pakistan or India, the problem is we looked at this slide and said, oh, okay, that's nice. But given these force structures, what would happen if we generated our nuclear force and the Russians didn't? Who would have the advantage? What happens if they generated their nuclear force? In other words, they went off of day alert and started loading weapons onto bombers, or starting putting submarines at sea, making sure everything was up and running. What happens in a crisis if we begin to generate in a ragged way? They go first, we go second, they go second, we go first. What will happen at various points in that force generation in a crisis? I don't know. I mean, you do the analysis, but there might be some windows in there where you could say, hey, if you fired right now, I bet you get most of them. I bet you get most of the other side's nuclear weapons. And there was actually an famous article written in International Security, Lieber and Kier, about the U.S. splendid first strike against the Russians, saying that, we could take a shot, we could destroy their entire nuclear force. It's not true. We couldn't do it. There's some assumptions in there that don't make sense. But there could be moments here where you could say, hey, we could take a shot. We could launch a splendid first strike and disarm them. Now, what do you think of that? Is that good or bad?
I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. Thank you very much, Jim Wirtz.
Thank you.